they can, because a democracy won't survive unless you have a two-party.
Rob Reiner is one of those rare Hollywood figures whose name alone can tell two very different stories. To some, he is the laughter-filled face from the classic sitcom years, the young actor who became part of people's living rooms. To others, he is the acclaimed filmmaker behind some of the most beloved movies ever made, the kind of director whose work quietly shaped entire generations. But behind the fame, the awards, and the confidence he appears to carry so easily, there's a side of Rob Reiner's life that most audiences never see. It is a story of complicated family relationships, expectations heavier than they first appeared, personal grief he had to work through outside the spotlight, and the pressure of living in the shadow of legends while trying to become one himself. Over the years, Reiner has opened up more frankly about the lonely moments, the self-doubt, and the losses that marked him as deeply as any success ever did. And when he talks about the choices he made, the friendships he built and broke, and the responsibility that comes with influence, the image of a simple Hollywood success story fades away. What replaces it is a much more human portrait, a man who had to grow through pain, criticism, and change, and who now speaks more honestly than ever about what that journey actually cost him. From the very beginning, Rob Reiner's life seemed destined to be connected to show business, but that didn't make the path easier. Being the son of Carl Reiner, one of the most influential comedy minds in television history, meant growing up surrounded by writers' rooms, sets, and expectations. People often imagine that such an upbringing is glamorous, but Reiner has spoken about how heavy it felt to constantly be compared to a father who was already a legend. As a young man, he struggled with questions many children of famous parents quietly face. Was any success truly his own, or was it just a shadow of the family name? Those doubts shaped his early years, especially when he tried to establish himself as an actor. Even after landing the role on All in the Family, which would make him famous, he dealt with criticism that he didn't quite belong or was benefiting from his last name. Fame arrived, but so did a new kind of pressure. Millions of people were now watching, but so did a new kind of pressure. Millions of people were now watching, judging, and forming opinions about who he was. His personal life during this time was just as complex. Like anyone in their 20s trying to define themselves, he made mistakes, questioned relationships, and wondered what kind of life he actually wanted to build. Success on television didn't magically solve insecurity. In fact, it intensified it. Reiner has reflected that comedy sometimes becomes a shield. The louder the laughter, the easier it is to hide how unsure you feel inside. While audiences saw a confident performer, he was quietly wrestling with direction, purpose, and the loneliness that often hides inside public attention. Hollywood is full of bright lights but very few safe spaces, and Reiner had to learn early how isolating that spotlight can be. The transition from acting to directing wasn't a sudden leap of confidence. It was born from curiosity mixed with fear that acting alone might not fulfill him. When he began directing, there was doubt from others who assumed he was simply trying to expand on privilege rather than talent. Yet he dedicated himself to learning the craft in detail, surrounding himself with collaborators who challenged him. When his films finally began to connect in a real way with audiences, there was a different weight that arrived: responsibility. Making successful movies meant carrying entire teams, financial expectations, and reputations on his shoulders. Every hit increased the fear of the first major failure. Every award raised the question of whether he could ever match that level again. At the same time, his life off-screen brought emotional moments that marked him deeply. Losses within his family and circle of friends, public criticism over his political stances, and the simple realities of aging pushed him to think differently about what truly matters. He has described periods of his life where career achievements felt strangely empty compared to private grief. These experiences didn't just change him. They softened him, made him more reflective, and sometimes more outspoken. The Rob Reiner admired today didn't arrive fully formed. He was shaped slowly by doubt, pressure, sorrow, and persistence. Learning that success doesn't erase vulnerability, it often exposes it. As Rob Reiner's directing career began to flourish, he entered a phase that many from the outside would describe as golden. One by one, films he touched began to resonate with audiences in ways even he hadn't fully anticipated. But what people rarely see is how much emotional investment is demanded by each project. Reiner has spoken about how every film feels like a personal risk, a piece of yourself that you place before the world to be judged. During this period, he experienced something that often happens to artists at the height of success: the fear of being misunderstood. When viewers celebrated the movies, they saw entertainment, but Reiner saw years of pressure, sleepless nights, difficult creative battles, and moments where he nearly quit. There were scripts that fell apart, projects that never happened, and criticism that struck deeper than most people realized. For every celebrated success, there were private disappointments, and conversations where he doubted whether he still had anything meaningful left to say through. His personal convictions began to intertwine more openly with his public identity. Reiner has never shied away from speaking about social and political issues he cares about, but taking that stance came with consequences. In a divided public landscape, being outspoken meant becoming a target. There were periods where he faced intense backlash, not for his art, but for his beliefs. Friends warned him that he might risk roles, projects, or audience goodwill, yet he continued because he felt silence would compromise who he was becoming. That decision brought strength but also isolation. He had to learn how to accept that not everyone would separate the artist from the advocate, and that sometimes the price of honesty is losing the comfort of universal approval. At the same time, Reiner was navigating complex experiences in his personal life. Relationships evolved, distances formed, and some connections could not be repaired despite effort. Like many people balancing demanding careers and family life, he faced moments where work pulled him away from those he loved, leaving behind regrets that surfaced years later. He has reflected on how time moves faster than you expect, and how success can distract you from what really requires your presence. Losing important people along the way, whether through distance or death, forced him to confront grief in a very real way. These losses did not happen on movie screens, but in quiet rooms away from applause. Where there was no script to follow, through these experiences, Reiner began to understand something that changed the course of his life and work. Legacy is not only about what you create, but about who you become in the process. He started to place greater value on the human stories behind the films, on kindness and collaboration, and on telling narratives that reflected ordinary struggles. His projects increasingly showed empathy for flawed characters, perhaps because he recognized those flaws in himself. Audiences connected with the emotional honesty in his work without always realizing it was born from personal reflection. The laughter, romance, and drama on screen carried pieces of his own journey, his fears, hopes, and attempts to make sense of the world around him. As the years went on, Rob Reiner began to look at his career not as a climb, but as a landscape full of peaks, valleys, and long stretches where the path wasn't always clear. Aging in Hollywood is its own test. The industry constantly chases the new, and even legends can feel pushed aside as fresh names dominate headlines. Reiner experienced that shift firsthand. There were projects that didn't receive the same enthusiasm as his earlier work, and moments when critics questioned whether his best days were behind him. Those kinds of comments can wound quietly, not because of vanity, but because they challenge a person's sense of purpose. Reiner had to rediscover why he made films in the first place, reminding himself that creativity does not expire just because public attention drifts elsewhere. This period also brought deeper self-reflection about identity beyond career. Who was Rob Reiner without a set, without cameras, without the constant role of being Rob Reiner the director? He has spoken about how easy it is to confuse work with worth, especially in an environment where success is measured by box office numbers and awards. Coming to terms with the fact that fulfillment has to come from within, rather than from applause, was not an overnight realization. It was something learned gradually through quiet routines, conversations with family, and the simple passage of time. He began valuing privacy more, cherishing the ordinary moments that fame often overshadows. Health, too, became an unavoidable topic. Reiner has acknowledged the reality that growing older forces you to confront your own limits. Energy changes, schedules change, and the body is no longer the same willing partner it once was. These experiences do not just affect physicality, they shift perspective. The idea of mortality becomes less abstract and more present, prompting deeper evaluation of unfinished dreams and unresolved relationships. For Reiner, this meant reconnecting with people, repairing what could be repaired, and accepting what could not. It also meant learning to slow down without feeling like slowing down was equivalent to disappearing. Despite these challenges, there is a resilience that defines this stage of his life. Rather than chasing relevance, Reiner focused on authenticity, on telling stories he believed mattered, whether or not they created headlines. He continued mentoring younger artists, offering guidance grounded not in ego, but in lived experience. Many who worked with him have spoken about the calm assurance he brings to a set, a steadiness that only comes from having weathered storms and remained standing. His sense of humor stayed intact, another survival tool that has followed him from childhood through every demanding phase of his career. In many ways, this chapter of Rob Reiner's life reveals the human truth behind longevity. Staying in the public eye for decades requires continual reinvention, not just professionally but emotionally. It means letting go of the need to be universally praised and instead choosing to live in alignment with personal values. Reiner's story at this stage is less about fame and more about wisdom, about accepting imperfections, embracing change, and finding meaning beyond external validation. It is here that the public figure becomes simply a person again, navigating the same questions of aging, relevance, love, and loss that everyone eventually faces. In the later years of his journey, Rob Reiner has increasingly spoken about perspective, how time changes the way one interprets success, failure, and meaning. Where once the focus was on building a career and proving himself worthy of his family name, now the emphasis has shifted toward reflection and impact. He often emphasizes that what truly lasts are not box office numbers or headlines, but the ways in which your work and your presence touch other people's lives. Looking back, he can see patterns that weren't obvious while he was living them. The moments of doubt that led to growth, the setbacks that redirected him toward better paths, and the relationships that grounded him when the industry felt overwhelming. The human story beneath the public figure becomes clearer with distance, and Reiner has embraced telling that story honestly. He also understands more clearly how vulnerability plays a role in creativity. Many of his most beloved works resonate because they explore the tenderness and fragility that exist in ordinary lives. That empathy deepened as he experienced his own losses and challenges. Friends, collaborators, and family members have described a softness in him, a willingness to listen, to acknowledge mistakes, and to keep learning even after decades of achievement. This humility does not erase ambition. Rather, it reshapes it. Instead of striving to be the most celebrated, the goal becomes to be authentic, kind, and truthful in the stories he tells and the way he treats people. That shift marks a different type of success, one measured internally instead of publicly. Reiner's legacy is now a tapestry woven from many threads: actor, director, activist, son, father, friend. Each role brought responsibilities and lessons, and none of them were simple. He has spoken about the importance of using whatever platform he has to advocate for what he believes is right, while also accepting that not everyone will agree. That acceptance of disagreement, of imperfection, of complexity is something that tends to come only with time. He recognizes that every public life contains contradictions, and that maturity lies in acknowledging them rather than pretending they don't exist. Perhaps the most powerful realization he shares is that life doesn't neatly divide into successes and failures. Instead, it unfolds as an ongoing process of becoming. Even now, he doesn't speak as someone who has everything figured out, but as someone still asking questions, still curious about the world, still driven to understand human nature through storytelling. The willingness to keep growing, even after immense accomplishment, may be the clearest sign of his resilience. It is the quality that keeps him relevant, not just in film history, but in the broader human story. For audiences who have followed Rob Reiner from his earliest performances to his most recent reflections, his life offers a reminder that the people we see on screens are navigating the same emotional terrain everyone else does: fear, hope, regret, love, and change. The laughter he inspired, the films that became personal favorites for millions, and the conversations he sparked are all part of that journey. But behind all of it stands a man who learned, sometimes the hard way, that fulfillment is found not only in what you accomplish, but in who you become along the way. His story continues, defined not by perfection, but by honesty, endurance, and the courage to keep telling the truth about the human experience.